Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 33 cheat sheet. I'm currently recording from Italy, so that's why the setup has changed a little bit compared to usual. Hopefully, the video is fine. If not, we'll be back as soon as possible with Game Week 34. All the content will resume as usual. No transfer plans this week because I am planning on free hitting. That's very unique, of course, from a strategy perspective. I totally understand a lot of people are going for a Game Week 34 free hit, which is also why the cheat sheet, once again needs to be considered for all players and managers. And that's why I've delayed this video to today, right? We wanted to get as much information as possible for Arsenal and Aston Villa players to really just get an understanding of what are the best medium to long term transfers. Long term transfers being transfers that go towards Game Week 38. Not too much long left, I think, for the season. Finally, I've had a pretty good green arrow getting to around 148,000 in the world. So, confident that I'll finish in the top 100K hopefully this season. It's been a slow slog, and I'm looking forward to finish strongly with the season. As far as, let's say, the cheat sheet, if you've never seen it before, it's effectively a tier list of players looking at the positions and prices and tiering them based on fixtures and taking into account, of course, wider strategy. One thing I'll mention is we still have a lot of uncertainty over what double game week 36 is, so that's why I have not kind of preemptively put any fixtures for double game week 36 because it's very uncertain. And then I think it also depends on fixture postponements and where they land. They could land on 37, which means that there's no doubles and blanks, but they could also just simply be, based on FA Cup outcomes, which we have no knowledge of up until they're actually culminated. So what we do know is that we have a double game 33 and we have a blank game 34. They're not too large, both of them, because they're just the inverse of each other. But as things stand, as I said, Arsenal and Aston Villa have a huge part to play with in strategy. And so let's just jump into the cheat sheet. In the midfield, we have Shade actually being added. I've probably discussed Mbumo and Wisa actually quite a lot within several videos, but I think one of the beauties of the Brentford players is a lot of us are going to be looking at players who will try to fill out different spots within our team, right? Mbumo is fantastic for that sort of 8 million to sort of 9 million spot in the game. Someone like Shade is going to definitely be a really good spacer in terms of someone who can maybe replace potential Newcastle players and just generally has really good fixtures to close out the season. And Brentford is a really good team in that their worst fixture until the end of the season is actually just this game week 34 match. So for anyone who's actually going for a free hit strategy, Brentford players make a lot of sense, even though they're really only a team that should be towards the end. So Sade is someone who definitely I think deserves to be on the cheat sheet because he's actually played very consistent minutes since the middle of the season, where basically he's just hammering out these 90s, and his underlyings are very very strong. And of course, there's times where a lot of people are arguing that he plays within a sort of double forward type position, and Mbumo plays out wide, but in reality, it's still a front three. He's a pretty key part of it. Semenyo also gets a rise too. He's now got his suspension threat gone. I myself was considering maybe a transfer towards either Mbumo or Semenyo this week if I wanted to move out of Kluivert, sorry. And Semenyo is clearly the option that made the most sense for me from a strategy point of view. But the issue with Semenyo was previously the sort of 10 yellow card suspension potential for 2 game weeks, which is no longer hanging over his head. He's now played enough games over the course of the season to get rid of that suspension threat. And now it's a really, really good run of games for Bournemouth players. Now, curiously, I would say for Bournemouth players, you still have some pretty bad fixtures in the distance, like Arsenal away. And yes, I know a lot of people do find Semenyo very boring, but he is someone who has really, really consistently good numbers. Yes, of course, he's underperformed a little bit this season, but we know that Bournemouth still have a potential double in game week 36. And overall, his minutes are very, very strong. So that's why I think Semenyo is always just going to be a top pick around this point in time. Minte and Murphy do get drops, and so does Barnes. I actually put Barnes actually as a green pick last week. I'm very happy that I did put him there. Did he get much more minutes than I actually anticipated? Yes, but I think his performance drove his own minutes. And that happens sometimes from football. You can't really predict how good someone's going to play. Barnes happened to have two exceptional games back to back, and that allowed him to play 180 minutes each. Whereas Murphy really, I would say, got the job done over the last 2 weeks, right? Anyone who's actually moved into Murphy has already enjoyed the full fruits of Murphy as a player and as an FPL asset with very limited minutes as well. A lot of, I would say, lucky chances, but you get rewarded for getting a player who is involved within a team that has scored 10 or 9 goals within 2 games. So that's Murphy for you. With Mente, he gets a drop because look, you're 1 game down from a Leicester at home fixture. Similar to, let's say, how Murphy and Barnes are down from a wonderful double game week on paper where you have had 2 home games and they were looking really good. on all fronts, right? But I think crucially with Newcastle, we knew that there were a lot of assets in multiple different positions that could have provided a lot of value. And it seemed like, of course, Barnes did. Isak, for example, didn't, I think, deliver the goods in retrospect. But actually, I think with a bit of foresight, Isak actually getting the amount of points he got is very fair based on expectations. It's just that players like Murphy and Barnes overperformed, even the defense arguably overperformed. And conversely, Crystal Palace is a team that very much didn't deliver against expectations, and that happens because, of course, you have Newcastle face off versus Crystal Palace, and Newcastle absolutely battered Crystal Palace, whilst Palace also missed a penalty. So these kind of things do happen. In the next tier, we have Rashford getting a rise. I actually, in different iterations of the cheat sheet earlier this week, and by the way, members of the channel do have access to the cheat sheet. There's a link there, and you can kind of see how my thoughts progress over the course of the week in terms of how I rate and evaluate players. But just watching that Aston Villa match within the Champions League, watching how I think that was probably one of Rashford's best games so far at Aston Villa, and crucially, Emery's comments have illuminated us to kind of letting us know that for the point of this season and maybe seeing out the season, I think Rashford and Watkins are very much in contention, and there's less of a chance that Rashford's going to play out wide than we probably expect. Yes, I think Rashford playing really well bodes well for Rashford, but he is very much still in a competitive duel with Watkins for minutes. And I think he's kind of claimed almost like an interim victory for now. And that's quite huge because we probably want to be looking at someone like Rashford as a midfield transfer. I am very much okay with people going for Rashford as a transfer now. He is confirmed on penalties. That was confirmed last week, fully within a quote from Emery. But I think we also knew that when we saw the FA Cup game when he took over Asensio. So for me, Rashford is just in a space now where his minutes on average look much better than Watkins. And that's very, very impressive. And I think in the worst case, there's still possibilities that Rashford can play out wide. But it does seem like they're both direct subs for each other, as frequently used by Emery, just because there's so much depth available towards that team. For example, in the Premier League, Malin wasn't able to be registered for the Champions League, but he's someone who can clearly play right wing minutes. Rogers almost occupies his spot all the time. Tillmans is playing so well that he's also doing the same. Again, has to play football somewhere. Ramsey too. So lots of sort of players who deserve minutes within this Aston Villa team. And unfortunately, Rashford's really only getting minutes away from Watkins, but he's playing a lot better than Watkins. And Watkins also looked really, really poor coming off the game versus PSG. And I think the substitutions of, let's say, McGinn and Rashford didn't really help things for Aston Villa. But as it turns out, Aston Villa do have an FA Cup semi-final game. And I think one of the questions that a lot of people will ask is, does Rashford start 2 and 2? And I think actually there's a pretty good chance if you do think, I suppose, Watkins is the weaker player right now, that maybe Rashford won't be able to start 2 games. But then I also would like to make the argument that if Rashford is going to be a substitute anyways, it's very likely that Rashford could still start all 3 games because he comes off a little bit earlier than other players. And if he's playing 65 to 75 minutes a game, maybe that's enough for Rashford to be a good pick. And I think I'm sort of in that camp, generally speaking. As far as Kluivert, he gets a big drop. I have to be honest, I really don't understand what is going on here. I think Irola has given, I wouldn't go far as to say he's as bad as some of the other managers who have misled us in the past, but the kind of information that he's provided, and unfortunately the Bournemouth sort of reporters have corresponded back to us playing managers, just hasn't been good enough, right? We've gone from fatigue to a muscle overload to somehow any of those two conditions leading to 3 weeks out from a footballing perspective. Apparently, there was a BBC quote that Clever will be back this weekend, but once again, he only really fits a free at 33 timeline. So I think he's going to get a massive drop. Savino gets a drop as well. I think we're starting to see Pep trial out different structures, and I'm not sure if Savino necessarily fits in a lot of them. We thought his minutes would be a lot better going back to game week 30, and it just simply hasn't panned out as such. And that's even in spite of Foden actually not playing good minutes whatsoever. So we're seeing players like McCaddy get minutes. So that's really, really not good. And Savino gets a drop. Trossard actually gets an introduction towards the cheat sheet here. He's someone that I took out recently because, of course, he's not really within the starting 11 for Arsenal. But we saw Martinelli put on a massive shift in the game versus Real Madrid. My team, of course, who just got absolutely crushed in the Champions League, deservedly so. But Trossard, I think, is very much in favor of starting this game versus Ipswich. And that's also why I struggled to sort of give Martinelli a rise because I can see Arsenal rotating a little bit more. I think Marino's a little bit more minutes proof because he just got his rest in the previous match in the league, and ultimately he's played a lot more minutes consistently than some of the wingers. And I think Marino's very likely to still play and start the next 2 matches. That's something that I'm saying myself. It's not something that I'm confirming. It's just my sort of think, general take on Arsenal right now. Given that the match was relatively smooth versus Real Madrid, there's a lot of defensive work there, obviously a lot of running involved, but I don't think that Arsenal were run ragged, for example, but we really didn't challenge them too much. And a lot of players gave a great shift. And someone like Marino who can play a mix of center mid and center forward, I think is massive. We also know that there are some other Arsenal players who unfortunately have been injured. So that means someone like Jorginho, for example, if he's not able to play minutes within the league, is just simply going to struggle to provide minutes, which will keep Marino out of the team. Things like that, I think, are very, very important to sort of think about. So that's kind of my thoughts on Marino. As far as the next tier, I've given Bowen a rise. I think, as I spoke last week, there was a little bit of reticence for me to actually have Bowen at a green tier. I think I almost on the video myself was sort of explaining to myself that I think Bowen probably should have been a yellow tier player, but I didn't do it because he just wasn't a transfer that made sense before Liverpool away. But now he's got Southampton at home and a great string of games. Plus, you get to avoid Brighton away. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not quite sure. But regardless, the actual run of games that West Ham have is very, very good. The only point that I'll make about Bowen is that he is once again in contention with Mbumo. And sometimes I do like to sort of tier players based on the idea that I know most people will only be able to pick one out of those two players. And probably if I was to pick one, I'd pick Mbumo. So that's kind of my thoughts in terms of Bowen, but I think he's a wonderful pick to close out the season, just given the minutes that he's expected to play and how good of an asset he is at this sort of price point with the fixtures in mind. Luis Diaz is playing really, really well too. I've sort of kept Jota at where he's at because Diaz is playing so well. It's kind of going back to that point in the season where Diaz is allowing himself to play a mixture of center forward and left wing. And we saw that Darwin had some sort of, I think, illness, so probably that allowed Luis Diaz to play extra minutes compared to usual. But I do think he's playing well, and that's something to be said. So that's why I think Luis Diaz does deservedly get a rise and gets an introduction to the sheet again. De Bruyne also gets a mention here. Look, he looked absolutely wonderful within the game versus Crystal Palace. There are different phases of the game as well where I think De Bruyne played, and of course we saw a little bit of false nine De Bruyne, which I think is a small sort of, I think, probably problem point for someone like Marmoush and the nailedness of him being a 90-minute player. We also saw Holland in training as well this week, so lots of developments in the City front. But we have seen that De Bruyne's actually mentioned he's pain free. I don't think that there's too much to take away from there other than Pep is a player who, in my opinion, does reward a lot of players for playing well. He also doesn't really mind playing players consecutively, but I think over the course of this season has clearly mentioned that the struggle with De Bruyne is mostly fitness related and age related. De Bruyne has played some really good minutes over the last two matches. Whether this will continue for the medium to long term, I don't know. There's a Club World Cup as well for City, but I think more importantly, with Foden potentially still being out and injured, that actually is a huge boost towards Foden's, or rather KDB's interim minutes, and I think KDB is going to get a massive rise on the sheet. So KDB is someone who I think makes a little bit more sense potentially on a free hit because you can kind of enjoy probably the best of KDB, see what happens with the FA Cup semifinal, and then kind of reassess. But yeah, he just seems like a really good punt in the game right now. If you're choosing him over Saka, though, I think that's the kind of issue I have. I still think that I'd probably want to have Saka towards the end of the season. Is there a possibility that Arsenal rotate a lot and Saka actually gets really, really, ineffectual minutes within the Premier League? Maybe yes, but ultimately he's still going to try to reach a point of peak fitness, and I think Saka will continue playing league games. Maybe just not at a ridiculous pace where we're expecting him to play 90 minutes like he does usually, but I can still see Saka playing 70 minutes a game. Whereas I still think KDB is in a world where yes, he's played effectively 90 and 87 back to back, but is it possible as well for KDB to be benched suddenly? I think yes. Whereas with Saka, I think it would only be in another sort of fixture congested situation where maybe later down the line where you have a match coinciding with, let's say, potentially a Champions League match, with a 3-day gap that you therefore then see someone like Saka may be rested. That's more, I think, impactful for people who are in a 3 at 34 strategy. So do take that into account as well. But I think Saka deserves a rise equally for that reason. Just pretty good fixtures in the distance. Yes, of course, the actual fixtures that close out the season, like 36 to 38, aren't particularly good. But I think his minutes will be more than good enough in Game Week 33. I think he's probably the captain choice that I would choose myself, just given that Arsenal have really, really good fixtures and there's a little bit more uncertainty around Marmoush, I would say. And that's pretty much it. In the forward tier, I think there's actually been a lot more changes than I thought. But one of the issues is we just don't have the quality of doublers, right? Mateta, his minutes look pretty precarious because you've got so many games now. He's not been playing particularly well, nor has the whole team, to be honest. But we do see that the manager likes to sub him off anyways in those kind of situations, and so that's clearly not great for Mateta owners. But I still felt like it was right to keep Mateta at where he's at because he does double at least in 33, and then you can kind of consider to bin him off afterwards, right? So he has a double in the distance. He probably starts the next 2 games anyways. Do I expect Crystal Palace to get absolutely spanked by Arsenal? Not really. So I think Mateta's minutes are strong. As they missing the penalty is also really, really good for someone like Mateta to benefit from such a situation, right? Because he's probably going to take penalties with a 100% share. And we're also seeing that Eze's minutes aren't great, right? Sarr, I think, has played much better minutes. He's probably been the fitter out of all 3 players in that sort of attacking trident. And going forwards, I think Mateta seems like a strong pick, at least for 33. And I'm still considering him, for example, as my free at 33 striker. But, taking a step back with some of those cheaper players, do we really need some of these cheaper players within our teams? Maybe not necessarily, but a lot of teams will still have the likes of Mateta. So that the reason why I've mentioned Mateta from the outset is because I know most teams have Mateta and are therefore to looking to move away from Mateta, but there's really no reason to do that up until game week 35. However, if you're on a team structure like myself where you own João Pedro, Evanilson, my thoughts are that Evanilson just gets a soft drop because the Bournemouth fixtures aren't particularly good. João Pedro seemingly is back on good minutes now, so hopefully not struggling with fatigue or some sort of random injury or niggle that will make me cry again as a manager. So I think they both just get drops towards that tier. Wisa actually gets a rise because, as I said, the Brentford games are just that good. Cunha, I gave him a sort of reintroduction to the cheat sheet last week. It was nice to see him score versus Tottenham. Some interesting social media posts, not that it's particularly relevant to Cunha, but whenever he's on the pitch, he's been astoundingly good this season, and it's very, very hard to ignore. Some really good fixtures in the distance, but then once again, with the 3 at 34 strategy, it really does depend on the strategy you're going for because Leicester at home is the 34 game, and then Man City away is the 35 game. So clearly, benefiting one free hit strategy over the other. With Wood, opposite situation potentially because he does have a good chance of doubling potentially in game week 36, depending on, let's say, how Nottingham Forest perform the FA Cup. I think if you wanted to sort of mention the odds, I have seen that City actually have more favorite odds right now in the FA Cup than before. So clearly, some of the recent maybe negative Nottingham Forest results and sort of positive City results have sort of moved the markets a little bit there, and that kind of reduces the impact and the potential chance of a double for Nottingham Forest in game week 36. But Wood still ultimately has some really, really good games to close things out, and he's fit now, which I think is huge. And also just simply doesn't have any competition within the team because Awani, even his chances to play over Wood, just hasn't played well whatsoever. With Marmoush, as I mentioned, there are some soft kind of impacts that we want to consider, but I think there's really no need to take a step back from someone like Marmoush up until after game week 35. We can kind of reassess with the Holland injury timeline and also things like KDB false nine, what those impacts are for someone like Marmoush as well. With Isak, he gets a soft drop just because the fixtures don't really align well with 3 or 34 too much. I think he can be a sell for some managers who have the opportunity to do so. The issue is that a lot of managers were probably planning for a transfer like maybe going into Watkins this week. And I really think that Watkins doesn't make any sense in terms of, um, you know, a transfer, I think he makes maybe a little bit of sense on Fit 33 if you're someone who is really firmly in the camp of Rashford has to get benched one game, to allow himself to be fully fit for that FA Cup semifinal. But I think Watkins, yeah, just his minutes do not look good whatsoever. Rashford has played really well. He has not. He did score, of course, in the game versus Southampton. I think that does go for something. But there must be some sort of fitness related issue as well that has precluded Watkins from being able to play considerable minutes coming out of that knock. I think it's taken probably a little bit too long for him to get good minutes, and right now I'm firmly in the camp of Rashford is probably first choice. Moving on to defense now, we have Konsa with a rise. It just makes sense because of the Aston Villa double. Is it a good double? No, but it is a double nonetheless. As you guys can see this week, when let's say Crystal Palace, for example, have a pretty mediocre double when it comes to the defensive games, it can go really poorly. At the same time, I think when you look at those Newcastle fixtures, not many people were actually really expecting, let's say, a clean sheet. But the reality of playing 2 games always, as ever, is that it depends on the opponents, right? Sometimes a team like United is a bit more attacking tilted, or rather defensively tilted, right? And therefore, you might want to have actually defenders going versus United. And a team like Crystal Palace actually historically has been defensively tilted. So it kind of makes sense for Newcastle to to maybe invest into Newcastle double assets, right? Because of the quality of those fixtures. I think a lot of people might disagree because they just think tougher fixtures means no clean sheets. But I think that actually applies equally towards the attack. But Newcastle still scored 9 goals in those games. And Crystal Palace actually on 2 games where you probably expected them to score a lot of goals, struggled to do that and also struggled really hard on defense. So I think yes, of course, it's very hard to sort of predict these outcomes. But when you look at the odds, I think it's very fair to say that this Newcastle double was really strong in general, but that they were probably really good for defense as well. As it turns out, if you missed out on someone like Barnes, you probably wouldn't have expected someone like Isak to get outscored by someone like a Trippier or a Shaw or Livermento, most of the defense really. So that's kind of what happens in doubles. I think you kind of just dare to chance yourself. There's at least one home game here for Aston Villa. I think Conte will play most of the games, seeing out the end of the season. A really good goal in the Champions League as well, with an assist from Rashford. That's not really relevant, but he's just a solid pick. And particularly at this price point where, you're blocked from an Arsenal player, you're blocked from a City defender as well. So you get what you want from this sort of price point. I wanted to discuss in the next tier Bradley a little bit because I didn't have Bradley in the cheat sheet previously. I just felt that Trent was definitely going to play some games towards the end of the season. It didn't make too much sense to go towards Bradley. I feel like I was right, but then also people got that really, I wouldn't say jammy Bradley haul, but of course they got a pretty good haul last week versus West Ham, and we now see Trent in training. Doesn't make sense to move towards Bradley. Maybe if you just really need that player for a bench boost, sure. But I think Wan-Bissaka kind of plugs that gap a little bit better and should play the rest of the season as well. So that's why I've given Wan-Bissaka a pretty big rise, and Bradley has only been introduced as a differential. A lot of Newcastle players will just simply drop because when they're playing singles only, you don't really want their assets. They're also a little bit counter to the standard strategy in terms of 3 at 34, right? Their best fixture is Ipswich at home in 34, so something to mention there. With Estupiñán, he also gets a drop because you're coming off the Leicester at home fixture. But the best players really are Kiwior, and I do recognize that I probably mentioned that some of the 4.5 and below assets don't play for Arsenal, but Kiwior is an absolute steal at this price point. Yes, of course, Calafiori could in fact play. Yes, White could play as well, and that could maybe mean for things like maybe Timber, a right center back. If Arteta really had to go there, but I do think that this pairing of Saliba and Kiwior has worked out really well. I can't really see why Arteta would sort of ruin the rhythm per se. And if you've seen, let's say, the Arsenal center back minutes going for the season, I think when Arsenal have had chances to rotate, he's probably rotated the center backs much less compared to, let's say, the midfielders or especially the attacking players. Like someone like Martinelli definitely gets rotated a lot more, even though he's firmly first choice. And Marino is probably the only player who goes against that, where he's, I think, relatively nailed, but of course, just even recently got a rest. So from that point of view, I think Kiwior is actually just an absolute steal. But a lot of people have to make this decision right now with triple Arsenal, where you probably own Saka, you probably own Saliba, you might already own Raya, so therefore you're blocked. But if you actually have only two Arsenal players, or you only have one Arsenal player, you therefore have the choice of being able to go to players like Marino, players like Raya, and players like Kiwior. And I think all of those options are fantastic to round out the team alongside Saka and Saliba. But in the next tier, we have Konate getting a rise, Timber getting a rise as well. I just think Timber will probably play more games compared to recently, right? A lot of the rests have been expected because he's also suffered from load issues. White does seem like he's maybe in training, so maybe he can actually play that Ipswich match. I wouldn't chance it though in terms of thinking that Timber is necessarily going to be benched for the Ipswich game. I think if you own Timber, once again, continue to enjoy the fruits of owning Timber. If you don't own Timber, I probably would actually go for Kiwior instead. That's my recommendation. With Konate, he should be playing most of the games towards the end of the season. I don't think there's anything to really question that. He's at a really good price point for that. And Liverpool just have good games, right? No doubles, once again. So a similar case to Brentford, but they're just a strong team to back at any point in time. Trippier gets a fall, right? I own Trippier. This is simply just, once again, the point of, do you really need someone at that sort of price point to close out the season? Probably not, unless you're on the same strategy that I am, where I'll probably be keeping him for Gimme 34. But Virgil also gets added for the same reason why Konate was added. It's just a case now where from this fixture onwards, a lot of people are looking for transfers, right? Someone that could even be a single game week transfer that can actually be really good for the rest of the season. So I think Liverpool and Brentford players fit that mold. At the same time, a lot of people are shopping doublers too, and I think that makes a lot of sense because you're either kind of swapping these short term gains for the doublers, or You're trying to get these medium to long term games whilst also getting a little bit of upside this week in the interim, where Liverpool still have a standalone great fixture, which is Leicester away. To close things out with the goalkeepers, we have Ariel getting a rise, Flecken getting a rise, and Henderson staying at where he's at. Kepa gets a rise, Saar gets a drop, Pope gets a drop, and Allison gets a rise. I'm not going to go too much. I don't think there's too much that we really need to sort of rehash in terms of goalkeepers. A lot of my thoughts in terms of the defenders have been explained. Ariola gets a rise because the fixtures are just amazing, really to see out the season. Same with Flecken. With Kepa, it's actually just a chance of the double that I think is quite interesting, worth looking into. And with Sa and Pope, it's just fixtures just getting worse. And Allison, probably, you know, a differential goalkeeper, but not someone that I think a lot of people make sense. But that's it for the week. So thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet. Hope you guys have a wonderful game week ahead, and I'll see you guys soon.